The alarm at Halden's Crossing Tribute Depot went from silence to full compliance klaxon in under 2 seconds, which was the first thing that told Watch Sergeant Orrin Bask something was badly wrong, because the depot's threat recognition system had never once, in the 4 years he'd served this posting, skipped its usual 3-stage escalation. It went straight to lethal threat protocol the instant the intake hall's overhead scanner resolved a face out of the morning's registration queue and matched it, at a confidence rating high enough to auto-authorize live fire, against a bulletin that had been sitting untouched in the depot's most wanted archive since before Bask had transferred in. The Ashgrave Killer, Suzerainty-wide capital warrant. Confirmed responsible for the deaths of 161 Calyx personnel across 9 tribute worlds. 9 years at large. Bounty: 3.4 million suzerain marks, payable on confirmed kill, no capture premium offered, because the Compliance Ministry had stopped believing anyone could take him alive around the 4th year, and had simply stopped budgeting for the alternative. He was already 40 meters into the intake hall by the time the klaxon caught up to him, walking at the unhurried pace of a man who had done the math on exactly how fast alarm systems processed a match, and built his stride around it, dressed in the same drab tribute worker canvas as the 200 other displaced laborers shuffling through the morning quota line, carrying nothing but a registration chit and the kind of stillness that made the depot's guards, once they actually looked at him, understand in their bodies before their minds caught up that whatever the bulletin said about him was almost certainly an understatement. "Lock the hall," Bask said into his collar mic, and heard his own voice come out steadier than he felt, which was the only professional accomplishment he was confident he'd manage in the next 90 seconds. "Full lethal authorization, all stations. Target confirmed at intake row 4. Nobody engages alone." 6 guards along the hall's perimeter brought rifles up. Nobody fired, because nobody had ever actually drilled for what to do when the confirmed kill of 161 Calyx personnel walked into your depot unarmed and kept walking, past the registration kiosks, past the confused knot of laborers scrambling out of his path, toward the far wall where the depot's administrative offices sat behind a security bulkhead that had never, in Bask's 4 years, needed to actually be secure against anything worse than a smuggled ration chit. At intake desk 7, on the near side of the hall, 18-year-old registry clerk Mira Rennick had her stylus halfway through logging a grain quota exemption for an elderly tribute worker's arthritis when the klaxon hit. And her first thought, the automatic, drilled thought of someone who had grown up in a suzerainty processing system and knew exactly what a full lethal authorization klaxon meant, was to get under the desk and stay there until someone told her it was over. She got as far as bracing her hands on the desk's edge before she looked up, because some part of her that operated faster than her training wanted to see what everyone else was suddenly staring at. And the man walking through the middle of the frozen intake hall stopped being a bulletin phode and became, in the space of one held breath, someone she recognized. It was not a face she had ever seen in person. It was a face she had seen exactly once, in a single scorched hollow, still that her guardian Rasa kept wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of a storage trunk and took out perhaps twice a year, on the anniversary and on nothing else, because looking at it more often than that had a way of making the missing feel larger instead of smaller. A younger man in that hollow, unlined, laughing at something out of frame, one arm around a woman with Myra's own jaw and Myra's own stubborn mouth. 9 years had put gray through his hair, and a scar through one eyebrow, and a stillness into his shoulders that the man in the hollow had never carried. But the eyes were the eyes Mira had spent 18 years being told she'd inherited, and something in her chest recognized him a full 2 seconds before the rational part of her mind finished assembling the impossible sentence. "That is my father, and he is not dead, and everyone in this hall is about to shoot him." "Corvin," she said. It came out of her before she decided to say it. Not loud, not a scream, Nothing like the panic every trained instinct in the room was braced for, just a name. Spoken the way a person says a name they've practiced saying out loud alone in the dark, and never expected to say to its owner's face. And it carried across the frozen hall with a clarity that had nothing to do with volume, and everything to do with the fact that absolutely no one else in the room was making a sound. The man stopped walking. For one full second, nothing in Halden's Crossing Tribute Depot moved at all. Not the 6 guards with rifles half raised. Not the klaxon still cycling overhead. Not the 200 laborers frozen mid-queue. Not Watch Sergeant Basque, whose hand had gone still on his own weapon because whatever training scenario he'd ever run for the Ashgrave Killer walks into your depot had never once included a teenage registry clerk, saying his first name like she'd known him her whole life and stepping, unarmed, out from behind her desk toward him instead of away. That was the moment every guard in the hall would describe differently afterward, and disagree about for months, and none of them would ever quite manage to describe it the way it actually happened, because none of them had a category in their heads for a wanted killer's face doing what Corvin Ashe's face did when he turned and actually looked at the girl who'd said his name, not the blank threat assessment stillness he'd walked in with, but something that cracked straight through 9 years of very carefully maintained control, fast and total, like a man watching a wall he'd built with his own hands come apart in real time, because it had never once been built to survive the thing currently walking toward it. "That's not possible," he said, and his voice when it came was rougher than the calm he'd carried through the hall, rougher than anything the wanted bulletin's grainy audio clips had ever captured. "Mira Ashe died at Ashgrave. She was 6 months old." "My name's Rennick," Mira said, stopping 3 meters from him, close enough now that she could see the scar through his eyebrow was years old, and that his hands the bulletin described in language that made her stomach turn, hands responsible for 161 deaths, were shaking, very slightly, in a way nothing else about him was. Registry name. Displacement processing gave everybody new names when they moved us off Ashgrave, said it was easier for the quota system. "Ross's the one who kept the old one for me, in case it ever mattered." She reached under her collar with a hand that was shaking exactly as much as his, and pulled out a plain iron pendant on a worn cord, a stylized wheat sheaf worked around a mining pick, the sigil of a colony that no longer officially existed anywhere in Suzerainty records except as a line item in a 9-year-old compliance report. She said it was my mother's. Said if I ever met anyone who recognized it, I'd know they were telling the truth about who I used to be. Corvin Ashe looked at the pendant the way a man looks at a ghost that has finally, after 9 years, decided to speak first, and watched Sergeant Basque, 6 meters away with a rifle he had somehow forgotten he was still holding, understood with a cold, sinking certainty that whatever was happening in the middle of his intake hall was not a hostage situation, was not a standoff, was not anything his 4 years of training had a name for, and that the smartest thing he could possibly do in the next several seconds was not fire. He was, as it turned out, one of the very few people in the Calyx Suzerainty who would make that particular decision correctly today. 3 floors up, in the glass-walled audit office that overlooked Halden's Crossing's loading yards, Prefect Calyx set down the quarterly tribute ledger. He had been reviewing and watched the klaxon light on his own status panel flip from amber to the flat, unambiguous red of a confirmed capital warrant match, and felt something in his chest that he had spent 9 years training himself never to let show on his face arrive anyway, sudden and total, like a held breath finally giving out. He read the flagged name twice before he let himself believe it. The Ashgrave Killer. Confirmed match, intake hall live. Desalin Vor, because that was the name Calyx had been born with, the name he had quietly retired the year after Ashgrave, along with the rank of Warden Correction Officer, and every record that connected him to a compliance action 9 years and 11 worlds behind him, in favor of a prefect's modest audit posting under a name nobody in the Suzerainty's promotion structure had any reason to cross-reference, sat very still behind his desk for 11 seconds, running through the same calculation he had run, in one form or another, roughly once a month for 9 years. How much of the old file still existed, who still had access to it, and what it would cost him if the two men in this building who knew the truth of Ashgrave himself, and the man currently 3 floors below him, ever occupied the same room long enough to say so out loud in front of a witness. He had told himself, across 9 careful years, that the odds of the Ashgrave Killer's manhunt ever intersecting with a mid-tier audit posting on an unremarkable tribute world were vanishingly small, that a man who had already worked his way through 161 names had no particular reason to know the 162nd was hiding under an assumed identity 3 provinces away from where the trail had gone cold. He understood now, watching the confirmation flag pulse red on his own panel, that he had made a very old and very human mistake. He had mistaken the absence of evidence for the absence of pursuit, and had never once considered that a man patient enough to methodically eliminate an entire chain of command across 9 years might also be patient enough to spend the last several months of it simply confirming, quietly and from a distance, exactly which audit circuit a particular prefect's travel schedule happened to run through before ever setting foot in the same building. Captain Dren, Vor said into his own comm, and was pleased in a distant, clinical way to hear his voice come out level. The intake hall situation, I want it handled quietly. No open apprehension, no formal detention processing, no live broadcast feed to the regional chorus relay. He is not to survive contact, and he is not to be questioned first. Am I understood? Prefect, standard protocol on a capital warrant requires. I am aware of what standard protocol requires, Captain, Vor said, and let just enough of the old Warden correction voice back into it to remind Warden Captain Ossifar Dren exactly whose payroll he'd been quietly supplementing for the last 3 years in exchange for a certain flexibility about which of the prefect's requests got logged and which did not. I'm also aware that a capital target who has spent 9 years killing his way up a very specific chain of command tends to have opinions about why he chose his final target, and I would very much prefer those opinions never reach a formal interrogation transcript. Handle it quietly. Today. He closed the channel and sat for a moment longer with both hands flat on the ledger he had, until 4 minutes ago, genuinely believed was the most consequential document he'd handle this week, and allowed himself, for exactly as long as it took to draw one breath, to think about Ashgrave, the compliance action he had authorized 9 years and 1 promotion ago. 68 names on a casualty manifest he had personally signed off as acceptable proportional response to a colony that had refused, for the 3rd consecutive quarter, to meet its ore tithe, and a young engineer's wife and infant daughter who had been 2 names among the 68 and had never, in his own private accounting of the event across 9 subsequent years, registered as anything more than an unfortunate rounding error in a decision he still believed, on the days he let himself believe anything about it at all, had been the correct one. He did not think of it as murder. He had never once in 9 years allowed himself to think of it as murder. He thought of it as a compliance action that had gone somewhat further than strictly necessary, executed under authority he had genuinely possessed at the time, and he had built an entire second life on the foundation of that particular, careful distinction. 2 levels below the audit office, in the narrow security corridor that connected the depot's main hall to its detention processing wing, 22-year-old Wachensen Pate Ilvara had just finished relaying Dren's quiet, off-protocol instructions to the 4 security personnel assembling in the corridor. No live feed, no formal detention, handled quietly today. And was standing with the words still sitting wrong in his stomach when Captain Dren himself came through the bulkhead door at a pace that had nothing casual left in it. "Captain," Ilvara said, falling into step beside him. "Sir, a confirmed capital warrant on a 161-count fugitive is standard protocol territory, not a discretionary call. Why is the prefect routing this off the normal detention channel?" "Because the prefect gave an order, Ensign, and your job today is executing it, not auditing it," Dren said, not slowing. "4 personnel, quiet corridor approach, no announcement, no live capture. He goes down before he reaches the administrative wing, and the incident report says he resisted apprehension in the intake hall before backup arrived. Are we clear?" Elvira had been posted to Halden's Crossing for 14 months, long enough to have absorbed most of the depot's unspoken rhythms, which quotas ran short and which ran long, which laborers Rasa Oyalaran in the storeroom quietly protected from the harsher entries in the compliance ledger, which of Prefect Kesh's requests over the last 3 years had struck him, in the careful, unexamined way a junior officer learns to file things he'd rather not think about too hard, as slightly stranger than they needed to be. He had never, in 14 months, been ordered to falsify an incident report before the incident had even finished happening, and something about hearing the instructions stated flatly, in advance, with the ending already written, settled into him with a coldness that had nothing to do with the depot's climate control. "Clear, sir," he said, because that was the answer 14 months of training had built into him, and fell in behind the 4 personnel moving toward the intake hall. Already, in some part of himself he hadn't fully examined yet, keeping count of exactly what he was watching happen and exactly who had ordered it. Back in the intake hall, the standoff that Watch Sergeant Bask had correctly declined to resolve with gunfire had settled into something that felt, to the 200 frozen laborers still queued along the hall's length, less like a crisis in progress and more like a held breath nobody quite knew how to release. Corvin Ashe had not moved from the spot where his daughter's voice had stopped him, and Mira had not stepped back, and the 6 guards still ringing them with rifles at various stages of readiness had, without any of them quite deciding to, lowered their aim by degrees as the minutes stretched, because it had become steadily clearer to every one of them that whatever they were watching, it was not a hostage-taking, and shooting into the middle of it felt, on some level none of them wanted to articulate out loud, like it would be shooting the wrong story. "You have a scar you didn't have," Mira said, low, because the alternative to filling the silence with something ordinary was filling it with everything she'd spent 18 years wondering, and she didn't trust herself yet to survive that. "Above your eyebrow." "Ashgrave," he said, "the last day. I wasn't there when it happened. I was 3 systems out on a supply run, should have been back 2 days earlier, and the run got delayed. And that delay is the only reason I'm standing here instead of being one of the 68 names on the manifest." He said it the way a man says a sentence he has recited to himself so many times across 9 years that it has worn smooth, no visible grief left on its surface, all of it long since driven underground into whatever had built the stillness Mira had watched him walk through the hall with. "I came back to a colony that didn't exist anymore, and a compliance report that listed my wife and my daughter among the acceptable losses of a proportional response action. I spent the first year believing that report. It took me most of the second year to find the woman who'd actually been on Ashgrave's evacuation manifest that day, and she told me a 6-month-old girl had gone out on a relief transport. An old neighbor smuggled her onto before the compliance fleet finished its sweep, and that the neighbor had sworn to keep that fact off every record that mattered for exactly as long as it took the girl to grow up somewhere the Suzerainty wasn't looking for her. His eyes hadn't left Mira's face this entire time, cataloging it, she understood, the way a man catalogs a fact he has wanted to be true for 9 years and has trained himself, out of self-preservation, never to actually let himself believe. I looked for that neighbor for 3 more years. Never found her. Started to believe I'd built a story out of a rumor because the alternative, that she was real and alive, and I simply hadn't been good enough to find her, was worse than believing it was never true at all. "Rasa," Mira said. "Her name's Rasa Oyalaran. She runs the storeroom here. She's the one who got me out." Something in her chest that had been holding very still for the length of this entire conversation gave way, and her next words came out less steady than she wanted them to. "She's 50 meters from where we're standing right now." For the first time since the klaxon had sounded, Corvin Ashe's carefully maintained stillness broke completely, and watched Sergeant Basque, still 6 meters away with a rifle he'd fully lowered without noticing, watched the galaxy's most wanted killer press the heel of one shaking hand against his own eyes for a single, unguarded second, and understood that he was looking at something the bulletin's file photo had never once suggested was possible. Not a monster confirming a kill count, but a man discovering in the middle of a depot intake hall that the worst thing that had ever happened to him had not, after all, entirely happened. It was into this exact, fragile silence that 4 security personnel came around the corridor bulkhead at a dead run, weapons already raised, and Wachensen Pate Ilvara, 4 steps behind them and slower than he needed to be for reasons he was still working out, understood that quiet was no longer available as an option to anyone in this room. "Down, everyone down, weapon discharge imminent," the lead trooper shouted, which was not Basque registered with a strange, detached clarity even as he dropped into a crouch and hauled the nearest laborer down with him. The wording standard protocol actually called for. Standard protocol called for a formal apprehension announcement. This was the wording of a team that had been told, in advance, how the report needed to read. Corvin moved before the words finished leaving the trooper's mouth, and the 9 years since Ashgrave had clearly taught him things that had nothing to do with grief. He had Mira by the shoulder and both of them behind the nearest support column in the same motion that put him between her and the corridor, not drawing a weapon, because he hadn't carried one past the depot's intake scanners on purpose, but reading the geometry of the hall with the flat professional speed of a man who had done this exact calculation 161 times before and survived every one of them. "That's my daughter," he said, loud enough to carry, not to the troopers but to every laborer and clerk and guard still frozen in the hall, because if there was one lesson 9 years of hunting men who hid behind institutional silence had taught him, it was that institutions moved fastest in the dark and slowest in front of witnesses. 18 years old, Suzerainty registry name Mira Rennick, born Mira Ashe on a colony your own compliance ministry's records list as fully evacuated before the correction fleet's sweep began. Ask Prefect Kesh why his security detail was ordered to shoot a warranted fugitive without a formal apprehension announcement inside a hall full of witnesses. Ask him why the order came down 4 minutes after his own threat panel flagged my face, and not 1 second before. It was, Ilvara understood with a lurch that felt almost physical, exactly the right thing to say to this particular room, because Halden's Crossing's laborer population was, as every long-serving guard on this posting knew and rarely discussed openly, heavily drawn from the Ashgrave displacement cohort relocated here 9 years ago under the Suzerainty's resettlement quota, people who had grown up hearing Ashgrave's name spoken in careful, unfinished sentences by parents and guardians who had never been given a full accounting of what had actually happened to the colony they'd been moved off of, and who understood. Watching a security team open fire without announcement on a man who had just said the word Ashgrave out loud in front of 200 witnesses, that they were looking at something they had waited 9 years, without knowing they were waiting, to see explained. The first shot went wide, because the lead trooper's aim had been thrown by a laborer near the front of the queue, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s Basque recognized as one of the depot's senior quota loaders, shoving sideways into the trooper's firing line with the deliberate, unhurried motion of a man who had decided, in the space of about 2 seconds, exactly whose side of this he was standing on, and did not particularly care what it cost him to stand there. "Hold fire," Ilvara said, and heard himself say it before he'd consciously decided to, stepping between the second trooper and her line on the column Corvin and Mira were sheltering behind. "Hold fire, that's a direct order. Corporal, lower your weapon." "Ensign," the captain's instruction was explicit. The captain's instruction was to open fire on an unannounced target inside a room full of unarmed civilians without a formal apprehension call. Elvira said, and understood, with the particular cold clarity of a man watching his own career end in real time and finding, he did not especially mind, that there was no version of the next several minutes in which he got to keep being the kind of officer who simply executed orders without asking what they cost. "That's not standard protocol, Corporal. That's a cover-up in progress, and I am not going to be the name on the after-action report that made it work." Somewhere in the crowd, a slate screen chimed, the small, unremarkable sound of a personal registry device recording, and then another, and within perhaps 15 seconds it was not one slate but a dozen, held up at various angles by laborers who had spent 9 years being told, in careful institutional language, that Ashgrave was a closed matter, and who understood, watching this unfold in real time, that a closed matter did not usually require an unannounced kill order against the one man alive who might be able to say otherwise. "Get them into the storeroom corridor," came a new voice, sharp with an authority the security team's chain of command hadn't granted her, and Rasa Oyalaran, 61 years old, built low and solid from 4 decades of physical labor, moving through the frozen crowd with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had walked this depot's back corridors for 9 years and knew every service junction the Suzerainty's official floor plan had never bothered to update. Reached the column where Corvin and Mira were sheltering and put one weathered hand flat against Corvin's chest, not in challenge, but in the exact gesture of a woman confirming, by touch, that a person she had believed dead for 9 years was actually, physically standing in front of her. "Corvin Ashe," she said, and her voice cracked clean through on the second word in a way nothing else in the hall had managed to do yet. "I told her you might be dead too. I told her not to hope for it, because hoping for things the Suzerainty took from you was how they finished taking them." She looked at Mira, at the pendant still clutched in her hand, and something in her weathered face folded inward for just a moment before the storeroom keeper's practical urgency reasserted itself. "There is exactly one corridor in this depot the security detail's floor plan doesn't show, and it comes out 40 meters from the relay control room. We are taking it now, all 3 of us, and you." She looked back at Corvin with an expression that had already decided something. "Are going to explain to me, while we walk, exactly what you're doing in my depot 9 years after I was told you died looking for evidence nobody would ever let you find." Elvira held the corridor for 11 more seconds, long enough for the 3 of them to disappear through a service door in the storeroom's back wall that had never once appeared on any floor plan Elvira's 14 months of training had shown him, and then found himself standing in a depot intake hall full of recording slates, 2 troopers he had just directly countermanded, and a watch sergeant looking at him with an expression that was not quite disapproval, and understood, with a strange, settling calm, that whatever happened in the next hour, he had already made the one decision today that mattered. 3 floors up, Prefect Ander Kesh watched his own status panel report the failed apprehension, the countermanded order, and the sudden proliferation of unauthorized recording activity across the intake hall's local network, and understood, with the flat, sinking clarity of a man watching 9 careful years come apart in under 4 minutes, that quiet was no longer an available strategy, and that he had perhaps one remaining option left before the story, currently spreading across 200 personal slates, finished spreading itself into something no amount of institutional authority could put back in its box. He opened a direct line to Captain Dren. "Full lockdown, every exit, the relay control room specifically, and get me every recording device confiscated before this reaches an outbound chorus channel, Captain, or none of the rest of it will matter." "Sir," Dren said, And there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there 4 minutes ago, a hesitation Vor did not have time to fully register the significance of. Understood. What Vor did not yet know, sealed in the relative quiet of his audit office 3 floors above a depot that had just watched 200 witnesses reach for their slates in near unison, was that he had already lost the single asset his entire 9-year second life had depended on, which was not secrecy about what had happened at Ashgrave. That could, in theory, still be managed, contained, litigated down to an unfortunate footnote in a closed compliance file. But time. A dozen personal slates now carried a partial recording of a security team opening fire, without announcement, on an unarmed fugitive who had said the word Ashgrave out loud in a hall full of Ashgrave's own displaced survivors. And every minute that recording sat uncontained on the depot's local mesh network, instead of a single sealed evidence locker, was a minute closer to someone deciding it belonged somewhere Vor's authority couldn't reach. The service corridor Rasa led them through ran low and unlit behind the storeroom's back wall, cut originally, she explained as they moved, as a maintenance access for the depot's grain conveyance system decades before the Suzerainty had annexed Caro's reach at all. And left off every floor plan the occupying administration had ever filed because nobody in 9 years of tribute audits had cared enough about grain conveyance maintenance history to ask why the official schematics didn't match the building's actual bones. You said you found the chain of command, Rasa said to Corvin, not slowing her pace, her voice pitched low enough not to carry past the 3 of them in the narrow space. 9 years, 161 names. I read what the bulletin said about you, Corvin, same as everyone else on this world did, and I want you to understand that not one word of it matched the man I remember standing at Alana's wedding making a fool speech about grain futures. So tell me what actually happened, because whatever it wasn't 161 people who simply had the misfortune to be standing near you. It was the chain, Corvin said. Every name in the Ashgrave Compliance Actions Authorization record, from the Warden Correction Officer who signed the original order down through every fleet officer who executed it and every administrator who filed the after-action report as proportional response. 9 worlds because that's how far the chain scattered once people started running. Promotions, transfers, quiet retirements to postings nobody would think to cross-reference. 161 names because that's exactly how many people the Compliance Ministry's own internal audit. The one they buried instead of publishing. The one I spent the first 2 years finding a way to steal a copy of listed as having direct authorization authority or direct execution responsibility for what happened at Ashgrave. He kept one hand near the small of Mira's back as they moved, not steering her, just close enough to reach if the corridor's uneven footing needed it. I never touched anyone who wasn't on that list. Never touched a family member, never touched a subordinate who was following orders without authorization to refuse them, never touched anyone the audit itself didn't already name as culpable. I know what the bulletins say. I know what 161 sounds like when the Compliance Ministry says it without context. I built that list to be exact, because the alternative, becoming the indiscriminate monster their propaganda needed me to be, would have meant Ashgrave's dead got avenged by someone no better than the people who killed them. And I was not going to let that be true, even when it would have been considerably easier. And the last name, Rasa said, the one you followed to this depot. Warden Correction Officer Desalin Vor, Corvin said. The officer who authorized the Ashgrave action and personally signed off on the casualty proportionality assessment. He retired the rank the year after Ashgrave and hasn't used the name since. Took me 4 years just to confirm he hadn't died in the reorganization purges like his file wanted people to assume, and another 3 to work out which of a few dozen quietly promoted prefects across the outer audit circuit he'd actually become. His jaw tightened, the first genuinely hard expression Mira had seen cross his face since the intake hall. Prefect Ander Kesh has held this posting for 6 years. I've spent the last 8 months confirming his travel circuit, and the last 3 weeks getting a registration chit that would put me inside this specific depot on a day. His audit schedule guaranteed he'd be here in person, instead of reviewing the quarter's numbers remotely. I came here for one purpose, Rasa, and it had nothing to do with a depot full of witnesses, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the possibility that my daughter might be working an intake desk 40 meters from where I planned to end it. Mira, walking close enough that his last sentence landed on her directly, felt something complicated settle into her chest. Not fear, exactly, though there was a version of fear folded into it. The recognition that the man beside her had spent 9 years becoming someone capable of methodically ending 161 lives and would, if nothing about today had gone the way it had, have added 162nd before dinner. But underneath that was something else, harder to name, that had been building since the moment she'd first said his name out loud in the intake hall and hadn't stopped since. The understanding that whatever he had become it in service of the same 6-month-old girl currently walking beside him through a maintenance corridor, and that every one of the 161 names had been, in some private accounting, he had clearly never let himself soften, a name he'd killed on her behalf as much as her mother's. "You're not killing him quietly in an audit office," Mira said, and heard her own voice come out steadier than she expected, carrying an authority she hadn't known she possessed until the exact moment she needed it. "You said it yourself, 161 names, all confirmed, all exact, all documented against an audit you stole a copy of. If Kesh just dies in a corridor today, the compliance ministry buries it the same way it buried the audit 9 years ago, and the last thing anyone outside this depot ever hears about Ashgrave is that its killer finally got what was coming to him. Nobody hears why. Nobody hears what actually happened to 68 people the ministry called an acceptable rounding error. You'll have spent 9 years building the most complete case against a war crime this suzerainty has ever tried to hide, and if he just dies, that case dies with him." Corvin stopped walking. "What do you want instead?" he said, and it wasn't quite a question, more the sound of a man who had built his entire remaining purpose around one specific ending, and was being asked, by the one person alive who had any right to ask it, to consider that the ending might need to be different. "The depot's tribute quota reports route out through the regional chorus relay every cycle," Mira said. "I've logged 100 of those transmissions myself. It's low bandwidth, mostly numbers, mostly boring, but it's a live outbound channel that reaches every administrative node on this audit circuit. And from there, it patches into the wider chorus network same as everything else the suzerainty broadcasts. If you have the stolen audit, if you have proof, if you have anything that isn't just a bulletin calling you a monster, we put it on that channel. Not a confession, not a threat, the actual record, 68 names, the authorization chain, everyone Kesh signed off on in his own recorded voice if you have it, and if you don't, in the ministry's own buried numbers." She looked at him, at the scar above his eyebrow and the 9 years of careful, contained grief behind his eyes, and understood that she was asking him to trade the one thing he had spent nearly a decade building his entire identity around. "You've spent 9 years being the Ashgrave Killer, because that was the only version of justice the suzerainty left available to you. I'm asking you to let today be the day that's not true anymore." Rasa, watching this exchange with an expression that had shifted somewhere in the last several sentences from grief into something closer to fierce, quiet pride, said only, "She's got Ilana's stubbornness and your patience, Corvin. God help whichever of you thinks you're winning this argument." Behind them, distant but closing, came the sound of a security team moving through the storeroom they'd left less than 4 minutes ago, and Corvin Ashe, killer of 161 names and father of exactly 1 living daughter, reached into an inner pocket of his canvas worker's jacket and drew out a data crystal no larger than a fingernail. worn smooth from 9 years of being carried against his skin, through places where being caught with it would have meant something considerably worse than a bounty collection. "I've carried this since the 2nd year," he said. "Every authorization record, every casualty manifest, every name. I always told myself it was insurance in case I was caught before I finished the list. I never once let myself plan for using it instead of the list." He held it out, not quite steady, and Mira understood that whatever he handed her in the next several seconds, he was handing her 9 years of himself along with it. "The relay control room. How far?" 40 meters past the next junction," Rasa said. "And Vor's people will have it locked down before we're halfway there, because it's the one room in this depot that actually appears on the official floor plan." "Then we're not going in quietly," Corvin said, and something in his voice, not the flat killer's calm he'd walked into the hall with, but something closer to purpose reclaimed, made Mira understand, with a clarity that settled the last of the fear in her chest into something steadier, that whatever came next, he had already decided which version of himself was going to walk through that door. 2 junctions back, Watchenson Pate Ilvara stood in the wreckage of an intake hall that had gone, in the space of 6 minutes, from routine tribute processing to something that felt considerably closer to the opening minutes of an uprising, and made the second decision of the day that was going to end his career one way or another. "Sergeant," he said to Basque, who was still holding the hall's remaining laborers in a loose, uneasy calm and watching Ilvara with the particular attention of a man deciding whether to follow a junior officer off a cliff. "Captain Dren is moving a security team on the relay control room to seize every recording device in this hall before the footage reaches an outbound channel. I don't believe that order is about apprehending a fugitive anymore. I think it's about making sure nobody outside this depot ever finds out why Prefect Kesh wanted him dead instead of captured." "That's a serious accusation to make about a superior officer, Ensign," Basque said, not disagreeing exactly, just naming the size of the thing Ilvara was standing on the edge of. "It is," Ilvara said. "I'd like your help making sure it's also an accurate one, because if I'm wrong, I'm about to end my career over nothing, and if I'm right, I'm the only officer in this building who's currently in a position to slow Captain Dren down instead of helping him." He looked around the hall, at 200 laborers who had just watched a security team try to kill an unarmed man without announcement, at a dozen slates still holding partial recordings nobody had confiscated yet, and felt something settle into place that 14 months of careful, unexamined obedience had never quite prepared him for. "I'm heading for the relay control room. I would very much rather not go alone." Basque looked at him for a long moment, and then slowly unclipped the rifle from his shoulder and checked its charge with the unhurried competence of a man who had just decided, after 4 quiet years of routine tribute processing, that today was the day his job finally required him to be something other than routine. "After you, Ensign," he said. The relay control room sat at the end of a short administrative corridor on the depot's 2nd level, a narrow space built around a bank of transmission consoles that handled, on an ordinary day, nothing more dramatic than quota manifests and quarterly compliance figures, and Captain Asafar Dren reached it with 3 of his 4 remaining personnel, roughly 90 seconds ahead of the 3 fugitives converging on it from the maintenance corridor below, which gave him just enough time to seal the room's blast door, post 2 guards in the corridor outside, and stand in front of the console bank with his sidearm drawn and a growing, uncomfortable awareness that he had spent the last 9 minutes executing orders he had never actually seen written down anywhere he could later point to. "You've been paid to look the other way for 3 years, Captain," came Ilvara's voice from the corridor junction, pitched to carry, Basque's rifle steady at his shoulder beside him, both of them having caught up to the fugitives at almost the same moment Dren's own people arrived from the opposite direction, so that the narrow administrative corridor now held, in the space of perhaps 8 meters, a wanted fugitive, his daughter, an elderly storeroom keeper, 2 security personnel loyal to a cover-up, and 2 officers who had just decided, independently and within minutes of each other, that they weren't going to be part of it anymore. I've watched you file 3 years of quietly adjusted incident reports and told myself it wasn't my business. It's my business now, because I just watched you order live fire on an unarmed civilian without announcement, and I am done pretending that's a decision I don't have an opinion about. "Stand down, Ensign," Dren said, and something in his voice, not quite conviction, more the sound of a man trying to talk himself back into a certainty he'd already lost, carried less weight than it would have 9 minutes earlier. "This is a capital warrant apprehension. Everything I've done today is within the Prefect's lawful authority." "Then let the Prefect say so on an open channel," Mira said, stepping forward past her father with the pendant still visible at her collar, and a data crystal held up where the corridor's dim light caught its edges. Let him explain, on the record in his own voice, exactly what lawful authority requires falsifying an incident report before the incident happens. "Because I have spent 3 years logging outbound chorus transmissions from that console room behind you, Captain, and I know for a fact it takes less than 90 seconds to push a manual override once someone with system access reaches the terminal. And there is nothing in any regulation I've ever read that gives you the authority to stop a registered depot clerk from filing a routine transmission through a channel she has legitimate daily access to." It was, Ilvara understood, watching Dren's face work through the calculation in real time, a genuinely clever argument, because it was also entirely true. Mira's registry clearance as an intake clerk gave her a legitimate, documented, entirely unremarkable right to access the relay console for routine quota transmissions. And Dren's blast door lockdown, however operationally justified it felt to him in the moment, was not actually backed by any regulation that let him bar a credentialed clerk from her own console during ordinary business hours, and every one of the recording slates still held up along the corridor behind them was capturing, in real time, exactly how thin that particular pretext had become. "Open the door, Captain," Bask said quietly, and there was something in the older sergeant's voice that carried more weight with Dren's remaining personnel than anything Ilvara had said. 4 years of quiet institutional trust suddenly spent on a single sentence. "You know as well as I do what it looks like if this ends with you holding a door shut against a registered clerk doing her job, while a prefect's private security detail refuses to let anyone see what's actually on the other side of it." Dren held the corridor for 4 more seconds, his sidearm still level, his own 2 remaining personnel exchanging a look neither of them tried very hard to hide, and then, with the particular defeated slowness of a man who had just understood that the order he'd been given no longer had anywhere safe left to hide, lowered his weapon and keyed the blast door's release. "For the record," he said, stepping back from the console bank, "I was told this was a lawful apprehension." "It was never that," Corvin said, moving past him toward the console with Mira and Rasa close behind. "And some part of you has known that since the moment you were told to falsify the report before the shooting started." Mira reached the terminal and had her registry credentials keyed into the outbound transmission queue in under 20 seconds, hands steadier now than they'd been in the intake hall, the particular calm of someone who had spent 3 years learning a system's exact mechanics, finally paying off in the one moment it mattered most. "Standard quota channel reaches every administrative node on the audit circuit," she said, working as she spoke. "From there it patches automatically into the regional chorus network same as every other routine transmission. Nobody screens outbound quota data for content, because nobody's ever needed to. If we push this as an attached compliance audit file instead of a live broadcast, it goes out flagged as routine administrative traffic and reaches every node before anyone upstream even thinks to ask what's actually in it." "That's not enough," Corvin said, and something in his voice had gone very quiet, very focused. A data file buried in routine traffic gets read by administrative filter systems, cataloged and forgotten in 6 months, same as the original audit was. I did not carry this crystal for 9 years to have it die the same quiet death the real audit did. He looked at the console, at the small transmission light indicating an open, live channel, and Mira understood, watching his face, exactly what he was about to ask her to help him do. I want a voice attached to it. Mine. Every name, every date, every authorization signature, in my own voice, live, so that whoever's listening on the other end hears a person say it instead of reading a file they can quietly reclassify. It was at that exact moment, with the transmission queue half-built and Corvin already keying the console's live audio input, that Prefect Kesh reached the corridor's far junction, 3 floors down from his office, and moving faster than his careful 9-year cultivated composure had ever required him to move before, flanked by his last 2 available security personnel, and understood, taking in the scene in the doorway, Dren's weapon lowered, a registered clerk at the console, a data crystal already seated in the reader, and the small, unmistakable indicator light of an active outbound transmission, that he had perhaps 4 seconds left in which anything he did could still change the outcome. "Ashe," he said, and his voice, for the first time since the intake hall's klaxon had first sounded, carried nothing of the careful prefect's calm he'd built across 9 years, only the flat, cornered fury of a man watching the last 9 years of his life come apart in a relay control room he'd walked into believing he could still salvage. "You have no idea what you're about to do. That audit is 9 years dead, and the moment you push it live, you're not exposing a cover-up. You're forcing every administrator on this circuit to choose between believing you or believing the ministry that's paid their salary for a decade. You will not win that. You will simply become, permanently, exactly the monster the bulletins already say you are." "I've been called that for 9 years, Vor," Corvin said, not turning from the console, using the old name deliberately, watching it land. "I stopped needing your permission to decide what I actually am somewhere around the 3rd year, but you're wrong about one thing." His fingers moved across the console with the same unhurried precision he'd walked through the intake hall with. "I'm not asking anyone to believe me instead of the ministry. I'm giving them your own authorization signature, time-stamped, matched against the casualty manifest you personally certified as proportional. Nobody has to believe a word I say. They just have to read what you signed." Vor's hand moved to his own sidearm, and it was Rasa Oyalaran, 61 years old, storeroom keeper, the woman who had smuggled a 6-month-old infant off a dying colony on a relief transport 9 years ago rather than let the Suzerainty finish what its compliance fleet had started. Who saw the motion first and moved without hesitation, putting her own body between the console and the doorway with the same unhurried certainty she'd led them through the maintenance corridor with. Because some decisions, she had learned across 61 years, did not actually require deliberation at all. The shot that took her was not aimed at her. It was aimed at the console, at the transmission Vor understood with perfect and total clarity, was the only thing left in the world that could still finish destroying him, and Rasa Oyalaran took it instead, in the same motion that had carried a dying colony's last infant to safety 9 years earlier, because she had decided, without needing to say so out loud, that she would rather absorb this particular ending than let it fall on either of the 2 people standing behind her. Mira's scream tore through the corridor in a way nothing else in the last 11 minutes had, raw and immediate, no calm left in it at all, and Corvin Ashe, killer of 161 names, father of exactly 1 living daughter, and now, in the space of 1 unbearable second, the man who had just watched the woman who'd saved his family a second time fall against a console bank with a wound that both of them, in the same instant, understood was not survivable, did not reach for a weapon he wasn't carrying. He reached for the console's transmission control, held it steady with a hand that had stopped shaking somewhere in the last 4 minutes and would not start again, and finished the upload with Rasa Oyalaran's blood on the console's edge and Vor's own sidearm still raised in the doorway. "That's live," Mira said, her voice breaking and steady at the same time, both hands pressed against Rasa's wound with the practiced, desperate motion of someone who had never once had to do this before and was refusing to let that stop her. "Every node on the circuit. It's already gone, Vor. You can shoot every person in this room, and it won't come back." Vor stood in the doorway with his weapon still raised, and Elvira watched something in the man's face finally, completely break, not remorse, not yet, perhaps not ever, but the specific collapse of a person watching the last available version of the future he'd spent 9 years building simply cease to exist in real time, and understood, in the silence that followed, that whatever happened in the next several seconds would be decided by whether Corvin Ashe chose to become, in this exact room, the thing 9 years of bulletins had already convinced the entire suzerainty he was. Corvin crossed the distance between the console and the doorway in 4 steps, and Vor, weapon still raised, backed against the corridor wall, and for one long-held moment every person in that corridor, Elvira, Bask, Dren, his 2 remaining troopers, Mira with both hands still pressed against Rasa's wound and her eyes on her father's back, understood that they were about to watch either an execution or something else, and had no way of predicting, from anything they had seen of Corvin Ashe today, which one it would actually be. Corvin took the weapon out of Vor's hand with a single, economical motion that owed nothing to rage and everything to 9 years of very deliberate practice, and did not fire it. 68 names at Ashgrave, he said, and his voice had gone very quiet, very level, the voice of a man setting something down after carrying it for 9 years. 161 after. I could make you the 162nd, right now, in front of every person in this corridor, and there isn't a soul in this depot who'd testify I did anything but exactly what the bulletins already say I do. He held Vor's own weapon loosely, not aimed, just held, and looked past him at Mira, still on the ground with Rasa, still fighting for a life that both of them already knew in some silent, terrible way was not going to be saved. But that transmission just went out under my name and my voice, telling every administrator on this circuit that I only ever killed the guilty, and I am not going to make myself a liar in the last 30 seconds of the only case I've ever actually needed to win. He dropped the weapon, deliberately, at Vor's feet and stepped back. "Take him into formal custody, Captain Dren, on the record this time. Let the Ministry's own audit, the one that's live on every node in this circuit right now, decide what happens to him. That's the version of justice I spent 9 years learning the suzerainty was never going to give me on its own. I'm not giving it up in the 1 hour it finally arrives." Dren, weapon still holstered, looked at Vor for a long moment, a man he had quietly served for 3 years, whose orders he had quietly adjusted incident reports to accommodate, and understood, watching the prefect's face collapse into something that had nothing of authority left in it at all, that there was exactly one decision left available to him that didn't end with his own name attached, permanently, to everything Vor had just been proven to have done. "Prefect de Salin Vor," he said, and his voice, when it came, carried the flat, formal cadence of a man reciting words he had never once expected to need. "You are being taken into custody pending a formal compliance ministry inquiry into the Ashgrave correction action and its subsequent concealment. Anything you say will be logged against the open record." He looked at his own 2 remaining troopers, both of whom were already lowering their weapons. "Restrain him, gently. Let the inquiry decide the rest." Mira barely registered any of it. She was still on the floor of the relay corridor with Rasa Oyalaran's head in her lap, both hands pressed uselessly against a wound that had already stopped responding to pressure, and Corvin was on his knees beside them both within seconds, one hand covering both of Mira's, the other gently, uselessly, brushing gray hair back from Rasa's face. "You brought her home," Rasa said, and her voice was very faint now, but there was nothing faint about the fierce, satisfied clarity in her eyes. 9 years, Corvin, I kept the pendant. I kept the name. I told her every single year that hoping for you was allowed, even when I told her not to expect it. Her hand found Mira's wrist, weak but certain. You don't need him to finish becoming who you're going to be, girl. You already are her. Ilana's whole stubborn heart, sitting right there in your chest. Don't let 9 years of bulletins tell either of you otherwise, not for one more day. She did not say anything else. Mira held onto her, and Corvin held onto both of them, and Ilvara, standing in a corridor that had gone, in the space of perhaps 15 minutes, from routine security duty to something he understood he would carry for the rest of his career, quietly stepped back to give them the only privacy the moment could still offer, and did not try to find words for any of it, because there weren't any that would have been equal to what he just watched. The transmission that went out over Halden's Crossings, routine quota channel that morning reached, within the hour, every administrative node on its immediate audit circuit exactly as Mira had predicted, and within 6 hours had done what 9 years of a stolen, buried audit had never managed to do on its own. It had reached someone who could no longer pretend not to have seen it. A junior compliance archivist on a records world 4 jumps out, cross-referencing an unremarkable administrative flag against her own department's dormant Ashgrave file out of nothing more than habitual thoroughness. Found Corvin Ashe's live, time-stamped voice, reciting 68 names, and a signed proportionality assessment that matched, number for number, a casualty manifest her department had filed away 9 years earlier under a classification that had never once been reviewed, and did something that a great many careful, cautious people across the Suzerainty's compliance apparatus had spent 9 years quietly declining to do. She forwarded it upward, formally, on the permanent record, to an inquiry board that no longer had any procedurally clean way to leave it unopened. On a tribute world called Sarrow's Bend, 3 jumps from Caro's reach, a night shift compliance clerk named Desin All was the first to notice the anomaly in his own routine relay traffic. A quota transmission from an audit circuit he had no working relationship with, flagged, on closer inspection, not as administrative data, but as an attached audio file that had somehow ridden the routine channel past every content filter his station's software normally applied. He played 11 seconds of it before he understood what he was listening to, and then played the rest of it twice more, alone in a relay station at 3 in the morning standard reckoning, before he did something he had never once done in 14 years of quiet, careful compliance work. He forwarded it, unedited, to every address in his personal contact registry, because some part of him that 14 years of institutional caution had never fully extinguished understood, listening to a stranger recite 68 names in a voice gone rough with 9 years of carrying them alone, that this was not a file that was supposed to stay contained to one relay station's overnight shift. On a frontier outpost called Kellen's Watch, an elderly woman who had lost a brother to an unrelated but similarly quiet compliance action 11 years earlier heard the recording secondhand from a neighbor's slate, and sat with it for the better part of a day before walking, for the first time in a decade, into her own district's records office to formally request her brother's closed file be reopened, not because she expected it to change anything, but because she had just watched. From 3 jumps away, what happened when someone refused to let a closed file stay closed? None of it added up in the space of a single news cycle to the kind of clean, decisive reckoning the raw footage's first viral hours might have promised. It added up instead to something slower and considerably harder to undo. A scattering of small, individual decisions, made independently across a dozen worlds by people who had spent years being told that certain files simply stayed shut, each one small on its own, each one together. The exact shape of the thing Corvin Ashe had spent 9 years believing he would have to force into existence entirely alone. It did not happen quickly, and it did not happen cleanly, and it was not, in the 2 weeks that followed, the kind of sweeping, decisive reckoning that the raw footage from Halden's Crossings intake hall, which had, by the second day, spread far past the depot's local mesh network, and onto every unofficial relay carrying unsanctioned civilian recordings across a dozen tribute worlds, made it feel, in the first heady hours, like it might become. The compliance ministry did not collapse. The Suzerainty's institutional machinery, tested across centuries of exactly this kind of slow, grinding accountability, did what institutional machinery generally did when confronted with evidence it could no longer ignore. It convened a formal correction oversight inquiry, appointed a judicial officer with no prior connection to the Ashgrave file, sealed Prefect Vors. The record now used both names, deliberately, a small bureaucratic acknowledgement that the alias itself had been part of the concealment, access to any further administrative posting pending the inquiry's findings, and began, with the particular unhurried thoroughness of a body that had never in its history moved quickly for anyone, to actually read what 161 names had died proving true. Corvin Ashe surrendered to that inquiry 6 days after Halden's crossing, walking into a regional judicial officer's chambers on his own, unarmed, escorted by nobody, 4 days after Wachensen paid Ovara, whose own account of the incident, filed formally and without a single adjustment to what he'd actually witnessed, had become one of the inquiry's earliest and most cited pieces of internal testimony, had privately told Mira that a man who walked involuntarily, in the middle of an open inquiry that his own testimony had helped force into existence, stood a meaningfully different chance in front of a judicial officer than a man captured running. "You don't have to do this," Mira had told him the night before, sitting across a small rented room single table from a father she had known, at that point, for exactly 6 days, still not entirely certain she'd learned how to talk to him yet, still catching herself watching his hands the way she'd watched them shake in the intake hall, still working out which parts of the last 9 years she was allowed to ask about, and which parts he needed more time before he could say out loud. "You could disappear. You've done it for 9 years. Nobody would find you if you didn't want to be found, and I'd rather have a father I only see once a year from somewhere safe than a father who walks into a Suzerainty inquiry chamber and doesn't walk back out." "I know," Corvin said. "I thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, for most of yesterday, in a way I want you to know about instead of pretending it never crossed my mind." He turned the small iron pendant, a twin to Mira's, one Rasa had kept for him without either of them knowing the other was still alive to receive it, found among her few possessions after, over in his fingers, not quite looking at Mira, working through something he'd clearly been working through since long before this conversation started. "But I spent 9 years telling myself the Suzerainty would never give Ashgrave an honest accounting unless I forced it to, one name at a time, because the system itself was never going to do it on its own. I was right about that for 9 years. I'm not going to spend the 1 week the system has actually, finally started doing it on its own proving I never believed it was possible in the first place. If I run now, Mira, I'm not protecting myself. I'm telling every administrator reading that inquiry file that the man whose own testimony triggered it didn't trust the process enough to stand inside it. I've spent 9 years being exactly what the bulletin said I was. I would like the chance, for however long the inquiry takes, to be something else instead, even if it costs me." "And if it costs you everything," Mira said, "if they don't care about context. If 161 names is 161 names, no matter who authorized what." "Then it costs me everything," Corvin said, "and you will have had 6 days with a father instead of 0, and I will have died having actually let the truth reach somewhere it could do some good, instead of dying with it still hidden in a jacket pocket where nobody would ever have found it." He reached across the small table and took her hand, the same gesture he'd made toward her shoulder in the intake hall, careful, still slightly disbelieving that he was allowed to. "I am not asking you to agree with the decision. I am telling you I've made it, and asking whether you'll be in the gallery when I walk into that chamber, because I have spent 9 years walking into rooms alone, and I find I would very much rather not do this particular one that way." The inquiry chamber, when Corvin Ashe walked into it 6 days after Halden's crossing, was not the packed public spectacle the raw footage's viral spread across a dozen tribute worlds might have suggested it would become. Suzerainty procedure kept correction oversight proceedings closed to general broadcast, a detail that had drawn its own share of public frustration in the days beforehand. But it held, in the gallery seats reserved for material witnesses, Mira Rennick, Wachensen Pato Vara, Watch Sergeant Oren Basque, and delivered by formal courier from a records world 4 jumps out, a sealed statement from the junior compliance archivist, whose thoroughness had done what 9 years of buried evidence alone never could. The judicial officer presiding, a severe, unhurried woman named Prefect Advocate Kessa Iron, who had spent 30 years adjudicating exactly the kind of institutional accountability cases the rest of the compliance ministry generally preferred to quietly bury, read the full transmission into the formal record before asking Corvin a single question. 68 names, an assigned authorization chain, and 9 years of a stolen audit laid out in a chamber that had, until 6 days ago, never once been asked to actually reckon with any of it. "You are aware," she said, when the reading finished, "that nothing in this inquiry's findings, however they resolve, restores to you the 161 lives you have personally confirmed taking across 9 years, nor does it grant you retroactive legal authority for having taken them. The Ashgrave authorization chain's guilt, if this inquiry confirms it as thoroughly as your transmission suggests it will, does not erase your own culpability under suzerainty law. Do you understand that distinction, Mr. Ashe?" "I understand it," Corvin said. "I have understood it for 9 years. I never once told myself I was owed a clean legal accounting for what I did. I only ever told myself that Ashgrave 68 deserved one, and that nobody else was going to give it to them if I didn't." He did not raise his voice, did not perform the moment for the gallery behind him, spoke the way a man speaks when he has finally set down something he has carried alone for a very long time, and is, for the first time in 9 years, allowing someone else to help him carry the weight of what happens next. "I am not asking this inquiry to forgive 161 deaths. I am asking it to confirm that 68 others actually happened, actually mattered, and were never in 9 years an acceptable rounding error in anyone's proportionality assessment. Whatever this chamber decides about me afterward, I will accept it, because I have already got the one thing I spent 9 years believing I would never get, which is a room that was finally willing to listen." The inquiry did not resolve in a single hearing, and would not, in fact, fully resolve for the better part of a year. The Correction Oversight Board's formal findings on the Ashgrave authorization chain, published 4 months later, confirmed every name and every signature in Corvin's transmission, stripped dis Saline Vor of rank, pension, and suzerainty citizenship pending a full criminal proceeding, and triggered in the following months 6 further inquiries across 4 other tribute worlds, where names from the same chain had quietly resurfaced under new postings, each one drawing directly on evidence a dead man's stolen audit had preserved for 9 years specifically, so that a moment exactly like this one might eventually become possible. Corvin's own status took considerably longer to settle. The board's interim ruling, issued the same week as the Vor findings, granted him a provisional stay of prosecution pending a full accounting of the Ashgrave authorization chain's culpability, explicitly acknowledging, in language that made the formal record in a way Mira suspected the board itself understood, was as much a political statement as a legal one, that 161 deaths carried out against a confirmed, documented chain of war crimes authorization occupied a legal category the suzerainty's compliance ministry had never previously had to define, and that defining it properly would take longer than the public's appetite for a tidy resolution was likely to tolerate. It was not, Mira understood in the months that followed, the clean ending she might once have wanted for him. No formal pardon, no ceremony, No declaration that 9 years of killing had been fully and permanently absolved. It was something smaller and, in its own way, harder one. A stay, a process, an open file instead of a closed one, and a father who was, for the first time in 9 years, not running from anything. Sitting in a modest rented room on Corot's reach 3 evenings a week, while an inquiry that would take the better part of a year to finish worked its slow, grinding way through evidence he had spent 9 years bleeding to collect. They buried Rasa Oyalaran on a hillside above Corot's Reach's resettlement district, in a plot the local Ashgrave diaspora community had, without ever formally organizing to do so, quietly and permanently reserved as unofficial ground for exactly the people who had done the most, across 9 years of displacement, to keep the community's dead colony's memory intact. More than 300 people came, most of them people Rasa had spent 9 years quietly protecting from the harsher entries in a compliance ledger nobody outside the depot had ever known she'd been softening, and watch Sergeant Basque, standing at the edge of the gathering in a uniform he'd worn to every depot shift for 4 years and had never once expected to wear to something like this, found himself, unprompted, telling Mira afterward that he intended to submit his own formal statement to the inquiry, because a woman who had spent 61 years quietly making a suzerainty processing depot slightly less cruel than its own regulations required deserved to have that fact entered into the permanent record too, alongside everything else that had finally, after 9 years, stopped staying hidden. Mira spoke last, at the graveside, and found, when she actually stood in front of 300 people who had known Rasa far longer than she had, that she did not have a prepared speech, only the plain truth of what the last 6 days had actually cost and given her in almost the same breath. She kept a pendant for 18 years, Mira said, and a name, and a story she could have let herself forget a dozen times over, because forgetting would have been so much easier than carrying it. She told me more than once that hoping for things the suzerainty took from you was how they finished taking them, and she was right about that. And she also never once in 18 years actually managed to stop hoping herself, because she kept that pendant polished, and she took that hollow, still out twice a year whether or not I asked her to, and she led 2 strangers and a woman she'd raised through a maintenance corridor she'd apparently known about for 9 years without ever once mentioning it. Because when the moment actually came, she didn't hesitate for even a second about which version of hope she'd been keeping alive the whole time. She looked out at the gathered crowd, at faces that had all, in one way or another, carried some version of the same 9-year weight Rasa had carried, and felt something in her chest that was grief and gratitude and a hard, settled resolve all at once, the same steadiness she'd first felt walking toward her father across an intake hall floor 6 days earlier. She got to see it. That's the part I keep coming back to. 9 years of hoping, and she got to actually see it land, even for just a few minutes, and I am going to spend whatever's left of my own life making sure the reason she got to see it was worth what it cost her. The Chorus Network carried, in the weeks after Halden's crossing, a version of events considerably more sanitized than what had actually happened in that relay corridor. The Compliance Ministry's official statements referred to an ongoing correction oversight review and procedural irregularities under investigation, language carefully engineered to acknowledge just enough to satisfy the raw footage's viral spread without actually naming, in any officially sanctioned broadcast, the word war crime. But the unsanctioned relays, the ones that had carried Corvin's live transmission and the intake hall's recorded footage, past every official filter in the first 6 hours, carried something considerably less careful, and across a dozen tribute worlds where displaced populations had spent years being told that colonies like Ashgrave were simply the unfortunate, unavoidable cost of an orderly suzerainty. Something had shifted that no official statement was going to be able to fully walk back. Not a revolution, not yet, not anything so immediate or so clean, but the quiet, accumulating certainty in rooms and depots and resettlement districts across a dozen worlds that the official record had been proven at least once, definitively and on the permanent transcript, to be a lie. And that other lies exactly like it were very likely still sitting, uninvestigated, in files nobody had yet had the reason or the evidence to force open. 6 weeks after the burial, on a quiet evening with the inquiry's first interim findings freshly published, and Vor's formal criminal proceedings scheduled to open within the month, Mira found her father sitting on the narrow steps outside the rented room they now shared, turning the twin iron pendant over in his fingers the way he'd taken to doing most evenings, and sat down beside him without either of them needing to say anything first. "Ilvara filed for a transfer today," she said eventually. "Says he wants to work correction oversight cases directly instead of depot security, Bask staying at Halden's Crossing. Says somebody honest needs to keep running intake, now that people know what happens when nobody does." "Good," Corvin said. "Both of those." He looked at the pendant a moment longer, then closed his hand around it. "I keep thinking about the version of today where the delay on that supply run 9 years ago never happened, where I was there. Where none of this, the 9 years, the 161 names, any of it was ever necessary, because I got to be a father the ordinary way instead of the way I actually got to be one." He looked over at her, and something in his face, still relearning across 6 weeks how to hold an expression that wasn't built entirely around either grief or purpose, softened into something that had genuine ease in it for what Mira understood was probably the first time since the intake hall. "I don't get that version. I only get this one. I find most days that I'm still working out how to actually want it instead of just accepting it, but today isn't a bad day for it. Rasa used to say hoping for things the Suzerainty took from you was how they finished taking them," Mira said. "I've been thinking about that a lot too. I think she was right, and I also think she spent 9 years proving her own rule wrong every single day she kept that pendant polished. I think that's allowed. I think you're allowed to hope for the ordinary version even though you didn't get it, as long as you don't let hoping for it make you stop actually living the one you've got." Corvin didn't answer right away. He reached over instead and took her hand, the same careful, still slightly disbelieving gesture he'd made a dozen times in 6 weeks, and the two of them sat together on the steps above a resettlement district that had spent 9 years believing Ashgrave was a closed matter and now, slowly, unevenly, at considerable and permanent cost, was finally being allowed to be something else, not healed, not undone, but no longer hidden. No longer buried in a file nobody had the evidence to force open, no longer a rounding error in anyone's proportionality assessment. And for the first time in 9 years, on an evening that asked nothing more of either of them than sitting quietly together while the light went down over Corot's reach, that was enough. Watch Sergeant Bask kept his word about intake. He ran the Halden's Crossing morning shift the way he always had, quota lines and registration chits, and the same tired arthritis exemptions, except now every guard under his command had watched, once, what happened when a room full of frightened people decided together that a lie had gone on long enough, and something about how carefully he checked each incoming manifest afterward, how often he actually read past the header instead of simply stamping it. Suggested to the clerks who worked under him that he intended to keep carrying that lesson for as long as he held the post. Ilvara's transfer request cleared review within a month, faster than correction oversight postings normally moved, and when he shipped out for his first assignment on the review board's junior staff, he carried with him a data crystal of his own, not stolen, not smuggled, simply his own formal statement, filed and witnessed and permanent, the first thing in his career he had ever put his name to without first checking what it would cost him. Mira kept the pendant, and kept the registry name Rennick on her official suzerainty paperwork, because changing it, she decided, would have meant erasing 9 years of a woman who had chosen that name for her deliberately, as protection, and Mira had come to understand protection as its own kind of love that didn't need undoing just because the danger it had guarded against was finally, partially over. She stayed on at Halden's Crossing through the autumn, working intake same as always, though she noticed in the months after that laborers who passed her desk sometimes lingered a beat longer than the quota line strictly required, not out of suspicion anymore, but out of something closer to quiet acknowledgement. The particular respect a community offers someone who stood in the middle of its oldest unspoken grief and made the institution that caused it finally answer for it. She did not think of herself as anyone's hero. She thought of herself, most days, as a registry clerk who had gotten her father back at a cost she would spend the rest of her life weighing against what it had bought, and found that she could hold both of those truths at once without either one canceling the other out, which was, she was coming to understand, mostly what growing up actually meant. Corvin never fully stopped watching rooms the way a hunted man watches rooms, some habits 9 years deep enough that Mira doubted they would ever fully leave him. But she noticed, in the weeks the inquiry ground forward, that the stillness in his shoulders had started slowly to soften into something closer to rest than readiness, and that he had begun, without either of them naming it directly, to ask her ordinary questions: what she'd studied, what she liked, what 9 years of growing up without him had actually been like day to day, the plain, unremarkable curiosity of a father finally allowed to be one instead of a ghost carrying a list. Neither of them ever pretended the 9 years could be given back. They had simply together, on a hillside above a resettlement district, and a set of narrow steps outside a rented room, started building whatever came after them instead, one ordinary evening at a time.